Good morning. We're also joined by Llew Claasen. I don't know if they missed you in that intro. Llew is the managing partner of Newtown Partners, who are experts in venture capital investments. So add that to the intro. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us. This is a panel discussion, but let me start by inviting you into the panel discussion. So if you feel that I'm grilling the panelists too much, you're welcome to try to save them. Wave feverishly and we'll send you a microphone. No, seriously, you're welcome to ask questions as we go along. The intention is to have a discussion that can also answer your questions. The context here really is that all of us as supply chain professionals see around us amazing change, amazing disruption. But I think we all sometimes wonder why we're not making the progress that some of the marketing material of some of the companies out there is depicting. And Christopher started earlier by saying that supply chain professionals and logisticians are the unsung heroes of the last 2 years, and I fully agree with that. But the reality is we still have the day-to-day responsibility to actually get things done. And Christopher, you spoke about supply chain control towers and how it's possible to extract value. And thank you for that perspective on adding other levers of value. But how do we deal with the dilemma that the C-suite still thinks that this is easy? And for them, a supply chain control tower, as you said last week in a client meeting we had, is actually just feeling in control. It's not about the algorithms and it's not about the digital twins as the question came. But so how do we balance this? And it's not hype, but the wonderful stuff that supply chain control towers can do with the expectation that all we really need is to be in control, to know when the truck is arriving, or to know when the production run is going to be finished, or to know when the supplier is actually going to keep to its promise. So how do we balance that executive expectation that actually creates some of the hype with the stuff that we do day to day?
Right. Thank you, Cobus. And I think it's a great question because up until the last couple of years, the C-suite really had no idea what was going on within supply chain. It just kind of worked and the company moved on. I think now there's a greater appreciation for the challenges. They may not understand the nitty-gritty details, but they'll understand more of what the challenges is, and I think they're quite frankly surprised. I sometimes think that even take the issue you mentioned around visibility, it's a little bit of a secret amongst supply chain and logistics people how poor visibility really is. And I think there's a general perception from those people outside of supply chain that, we can kind of see everything and it all just magically works. So that's probably one of the good news of the last couple of years, is that it's really opened the door on the complexity. I would actually come back to the way to make it relevant for the C-suite. I'd come back to what I mentioned earlier is around use cases and being highly focused on what are the specific business issues we're trying to solve, and what is the right way to deploy technology and processes to get at that system. And I find that speaking about just the broad-based visibility, broad this, broad that, it misses the point, and it's hard to get the investment and the attention of the C-suite. So being much more specific about what you're solving, and I think the same is true with digital startups. And I know we'll talk a little bit about that. Is that the ones that tend to do better tend to be much more focused on here's the problem I'm trying to solve, as opposed to trying to create the brave new world in totality.
Cool, thanks. And you're welcome to also jump into these questions, but let's go towards the world of startups or new businesses, disruptive businesses, the world Llew works in. And to make it a bit practical, understand the math. One of our proud sponsors here is by DSV, is by any measure the most valuable and highest growing 3PL or logistics service provider in the world. They have revenue of more than 30 billion rand. They are valued at about the same, just more, 1.2 times revenue. But it makes sense because they actually make $3 billion of profit. So 10 times EBITDA, 12 times EBITDA, it works in cash flow. But then you have a little other business called Uber Freight, who is today astonishingly already 10% as big as DSV. So by no means a startup anymore. But they are worth half of DSV, almost $20 billion. But they haven't made $1 of profit, ever. How does that work, Llew?
So I ask myself that question all the time. No, I think that there's always an expectation that digital startups have these certain advantages, whether they're network effects, first move advantages, technology, business model, something that enables them to grow at a rate that is faster than a typical non-digital business. And that's not to say, so basically sort of technology first versus technology being utilized in the business. And so in the case of an Uber Freight, for example, the expectation is that they must grow faster than a more traditional business, than a DSV. And over time, those revenue multiples and EBITDA multiples will converge theoretically on about the same number. But in the short term, what it means is that they're much more valuable, or their revenue is much more valuable than a traditional business like DSV.
Yeah, I think maybe just add the difference between valuation and price is also important for us to understand that often people refer to valuation as if there was a mathematical model.
Yeah. So it's exactly, that is exactly one of the key challenges for us, is that there's this expectation that people are like, well, how can it possibly be worth that? If we do the financial model tells us that it should be worth something else. And the reality is it's not just about the financial model. The financial model gives you an indication of how the value is being created and the extent of the value being created, but ultimately it boils down to what is the market willing to pay as a premium for that growth. And as I said before, faster growing businesses their revenue is valued more highly. And so we have the situation where it's not a question of what does your financial model tell you should pay, but rather who are you competing against and what are they willing to pay for the same revenue?
Christopher?
And if I may just add on to the Uber Freight example is, back when Llew and Bill started this business 7-8 years ago, it was really, they thought about it in terms of new business model first, then new technology, and then the financial value in that order. So they started off, I'm not sure how well known this is, but they started off in Texas in the US, and they basically took one lane between, I think it was Dallas and Houston, some very short lanes, and then they expanded Texas to California, Texas to Chicago. So just a couple of lanes, and they focused on the new business model that they had around truck brokerage just on those lanes. Now, they started off using a spreadsheet. It was all manual. And then they got really sophisticated. They put it on Google Docs. And so literally they were matching loads 100% manual. People using Google Docs, matching loads. But they were using a new business model. And then they started to develop an app. And then they worked that through, and then they got 20, 30% load matching. But they knew that the long-term business model was 99.8% load matching automatically at zero incremental cost. And that's where they needed to get to. But the business model would get them there. The technology followed actually several years later. So they had the plan for it, but it took them several years to get the technology in place. And they built up the scale using very tried and true logistics methods for building density. You don't try to do everything to all people. So they really thought through the business model as they were building it out. And then you look at them now, and you could say that they now have enough scale to become profitable, to actually make the financials ultimately work now. And so, but Amazon did the same thing. Amazon was losing money and then breaking even for years and years and years, and now they're printing money once they get to a certain scale. So it's It's important to realize, yes, it is a technology company, but I would suggest, and Llew knows more about this than I do, but I would suggest that it's really around what's the disruptive business model? Can you get the technology in place to support that? And then ultimately, will that lead to the financial outcomes? And in some cases, yes. In some cases, you'll see valuations that potentially will stick, and in other cases, it will not.
I think. Sorry, I just want to add a comment on that. I think that the other thing that's important about these disruptive business models is that they are relevant to a time and a place until they get to scale, and then you can go into other sectors. So if you think about Uber Freight specifically, by not a small business at all, but for a long time it was hovering around the $200, $300, $400 million worth of revenue per quarter, and then suddenly Q4, it went up to $1 billion, Q1, 22, $1.8 billion worth of revenue, because there is major trucker shortages and congestion in US ports. And so it was a solution that was relevant to those specific problems at that point in time. And suddenly you just see massive growth, which is dramatically more than what traditional businesses are at that point in time capable of doing.
Now, let me take that lead. Thanks for those inputs in terms of disruption through business model. And I reflected yesterday on it in a response in a session upstairs, that what corporates battle with is to disrupt their business model, is to say, well, how do we work differently? Again, Christopher, you referred to ways of working. And I want to ask you, in the procurement world, is there enough rethink of the business model, of the way of working, or are we just trying harder to buy better, but we still don't get the master data right, and we still don't get the damn suppliers to perform as they should? So what is the disruption doing in the world of procurement to actually make supply chains operate better?
Thanks, Cobus. I think it's a very interesting question. So procurement traditionally has been a back office function, across the board. But in the last decade or so, we have seen major transformation, especially within the procurement space. A lot of companies are going through the digitization wave, but that's just the beginning, right? The real essence of digitization is not only connecting the dots within the four walls of the boundary, but also outside the four walls, right? In the last 3 years, right, I'm just counting last 3 years, the amount of disruption supply chain has seen, I think it's time to think radically different, right? First, the pandemic. Then I'm sure a lot of you would have heard about the Suez Canal crisis. Very recently, the Russia-Ukraine war. And now China lockdown, right? So all these incidents are forcing us to rethink of how do we actually gain visibility as far as the supply base is concerned, right? Now, as supply chain professionals, you need to have visibility on your supply base, whether this particular supplier will actually be able to deliver the goods and services that we have requested for, right? And at times, buyer who's actually doing that transaction do not have that visibility. So how about having systems who's actually giving those information to the buyer for him to make those informed decisions, right? To answer your other part of the question, while this looks like Rolls-Royce, my master data is still a big challenge, right? Yes, that's definitely a massive challenge. But I think one thing that we learned in the last few years is you need to do your basics right. Fix your basics, get those master data issues sorted, because only if you fix your basics, that's where you can go to level 2 and level 3, right? Digitization, saying is easy, but actually doing is not that easy, right? But once you do it, I think you're setting your baseline for future, right? I've seen a lot of customers, they've actually, and we have seen massive growth, especially in Africa and in particular in South Africa, where digitization is picking up its pace to a great extent. A few years back, there was no digitization, but now, at least I'm seeing a massive growth. People are digitizing their processes, And they're getting immense value because work from home also entails that you need to have those visibility in your processes. You cannot run your business with the age-old processes that you used to have.
Thank you. Again, invitation for questions from the floor as we go along. Anytime, please just put up your hand and we can get a mic to you.
Can I make a comment on the business model point,
Sure.
if you don't mind? I think that it's also very tempting to kind of go, new is better, digitization of everything, and sort of maybe an asset-light business model is always going to be better than an asset-heavy business model. And in reality, what we found in the last 2 years with impact of COVID and Ukraine crisis and things like that, is that that's not always true. If you think about developing markets in particular, what we found is, so we've made some investments into road freight exchanges and some other businesses as well. We found that road freight exchanges in developed markets were very successful, but road freight exchanges in developing markets were not successful. And we wanted to understand more why that was the case, because theoretically you have access to an unlimited number of trucks that want to be able to move goods. The reality is that we found that those trucks are not necessarily of a standard that enables you to serve the customer needs. And so it's almost like part of the process is also sort of dipping your toe in the water, testing a business model and kind of seeing, well, is that something that's going to work for my customers? And sometimes it just doesn't. So just I would just say keep that in mind as well. It's not just about asset light, it's always better.
Yeah, and I think maybe let me add to that and then explore a bit further around the world of startups. Is the other bit is that not all startups succeed. To the contrary, a very, very, very small percentage of startups succeed. And in our experience, the worst thing you can do is pick somebody's pitch deck and think it's a good idea. There's much more to it. But my question to you, Llew, is how do you find this balance to learn from startups, to understand how they will disrupt you, to help them, but not rely on them because actually they may fail. And then, even worse so, corporates will actually force startups to fail if you get this wrong. So how do you work in this world of startups to make the most of it without taking too many risks?
Yeah. So I think that the first step in the process is to kind of go, do not assume that corporates can do disruptive innovation. Not because these people are not intelligent, not because they're not well informed. It's just that large businesses are optimized for efficiency. They're not optimized to make innovations at the edge of the network. And if you think about the chaos that would ensue if you had to give people the opportunity to be innovative in every part of the business process, then you can quickly understand why corporates should not work like that. But the converse of that is to say, well, if they're optimized for that kind of efficiency, then they naturally cannot do these weird and wonderful disruptive innovation type things. And so our view on it is that you need to separate that from the parent organization and take a long-term view on how markets will change over time and kind of say, well, in our case, we use a tool called corporate venture capital. So what we say is we do a bunch of research. It might be into freight forwarding. It might be into road freight. It might be into supply chain visibility, whatever that might be. And we say, well, how do we think that changes the base of competition over 5 to 10 years' time? And what do we think the capabilities are that you're going to need as a large organization over 5 to 10 years' time in order to be competitive? And we would then invest into a thesis, and we would say, we think the following things are really important over 5 to 10 years' time. But we don't know for certain that that is going to be the case. That by its nature is that we're trying to test different ideas. And luckily for us, there are startups that are trying different versions of those tests. So, somebody might say, well, I think that the answer is you need to embed IoT into the device. Then another might say, well, it needs to be about software or something. And so we typically invest into a couple of those spaces, and some of them work and some of them don't. And across a portfolio of investments, we eventually have an insight into how the market develops and what we believe the capabilities are that are going to be the source of competitive advantage over long periods of time. But to your point, not everything works, which is even more of a reason why insourcing it is really hard, because because you're effectively then betting on this must be the answer, whereas when you're outsourcing it, you're kind of going, we're taking bets across, say, for example, 3 investments, and one of them might work out, or at the very least tell us where this market is going.
Yeah,
maybe I can quickly add to one of the examples that we have seen. There's a massive change that's happening, right? So, for example, in the world of sourcing and procurement, we have got some new examples where procurement is actually becoming a more profit center and revenue generating organizations through new business models, right? For example, how can you drive, sourcing as a service, right? So typically, a company actually does sourcing on behalf of other companies, right? So, and how it differentiates itself from the large e-com retailers would be like, e-com, you get standard goods, right? Let's say, stationeries, office supplies, that's okay. But when it comes to an investor who's actually investing in a country and he needs to set up a factory, right? He needs the right sourcing partner who can do it and deliver it for him. So we are seeing those changes that is coming in Africa. If you go out and in one of the booths, you would see Bayajula. So they have launched their service, which is called Sourcing as a Service. It's, again, a startup. So they can help doing source goods and services at a much cheaper rate. And how they would be able to do it, because they can consolidate volumes from different companies and they can get much better rate, because that's the only thing that they do, right? So outsourcing of sourcing is something that we have seen a great trend across Africa. We will have significant influx of these new business models that is coming in the world of procurement that will help them to make procurement more of a revenue center than a cost center.
Just one thing to add, so fully agree with both of those points. There's one other model that does work for some types of innovation within large corporations, but you need to manage it very carefully. And a lot of that is around innovation in your products and services. So not a fundamental rethink of your entire business model. That's really difficult to do in a company. Maybe I wouldn't say impossible, but you could probably, on one hand, you could probably come up with a number of companies that have done that successfully. But a lot of even significant innovation in terms of how you deliver your products and services can be done within large companies, but it has to be done in a very methodical way around how do you incubate it, how do you protect that incubation from all the corporate pressures, the normal pressures that would kill these things in the starting point, and then how do you take successful POCs and help them scale up to become somewhat viable, and then how do you take these viable new innovations into the mainstream of your company? And it all sounds really logical, like, oh, okay, well, you incubate and you do a proof of concept, you scale it, and then you put it across your business. But each one of those steps is incredibly hard and is going to face a huge amount of internal resistance. So you need to have a methodology and leadership, and you need to think that through and do it in a very deliberate way, or it will die at any one of those points. And it's a small number of companies that are actually able to take that all the way through, but it can be done. Again, not a fundamental rethink of your business model, but some pretty significant innovations within the four walls of your business model.
Yeah, I think maybe let me add to that, and then you can respond again to how having a growth mindset makes that easier. So the fact that you know that your organization has to change, it has to innovate, but it's caught up in its corporate inertia. It's making this week or this month's or this quarter's profits, and to change would probably mean that you have to restructure or reorganize, compared to innovate and change with a growth mindset that says, well, I'm doing this because I have to grow. If I don't do this, at best I will trickle along. And I think this disruption in its nature is about change and growth. But in your experience, maybe, right, Christopher, again, how much easier is it if the organization has a growth mindset rather than a protect type mindset?
It's absolutely essential. You're 100% right, Cobus. And the super simplistic way that you might want to think about it is in 3 steps. And one, it's actually what you said is you start with a protection mindset. You protect your core, you protect your stronghold. Where are you making your money today? Protect that. And what can you do more to protect that? So that's step one. But you're right, a lot of companies just stop there. And then the second piece is really around enhancing the core and enhancing what are the enablers, what are the pieces like supply chain, but other places like new technology, and how do you actually enhance your underlying business? And that starts to get at to the growth mindset, but that's sort of halfway there. But then the third place is you need to nurture the new growth areas. So you look 5 years in the future. Where are the strongholds of the future? 5 years in the future, 10 years in the future, and then you ask yourself, okay, if it's 10 years in the future, how can I do that in 2 years, not 10 years? But that really gets you to the growth mindset without throwing away everything that's made you successful. And so it's really just those 3 steps. But it does speak to your point around mindset, which is absolutely critical.
I think again then, if you take those horizons or focus areas, understanding where technology and disruption can play, again, because it plays everywhere. At the core, it could be through RPA, or and maybe Ayan, you can give us more of what's helping efficiency gains, removing errors, just getting the basics right, as you said earlier.
Yep.
How's technology helping us at that? Whether you call it protecting the core or getting the basics right. And are we underestimating how much is to be gained by actually disrupting our own ways of working in that space?
A very good question, Cobus. I think from a technology standpoint, we hear a lot of these technologies, upcoming technologies, RPA, AI, machine learning, blockchain. But how much of it is actually being applied in our day-to-day work, right? So that's the question that we are always asking ourselves. But the reality is that there are a lot of processes and use cases that is coming up. Just giving you small examples around now. Let's say the demand planning, right? So demand planning is not limited only within your organization. You can have the best plan, but if you can't share that plan and collaborate with the plan with your suppliers, I think it's immaterial. And that's where the business network concept comes up, right? So how can you bring all those different pieces, be it your suppliers, be it your multi-level suppliers, be the financial institutions, all of it in one network, and how can you actually leverage that, right? Coming to the next part around, use cases based on machine learning, right? So how machine learning can actually help employees and supply chain professionals utilize the internal data and learn the behavior of that particular person and help to ease his work, right? I think those are use cases that different companies are building up. Invoice verification is another one. It's a massive challenge for most organizations, precisely because we live in a world where huge amount of data is processed every second, right? But how are we utilizing that data, and how are we learning from the data and making relevant decisions out of that data? And I think that's a big challenge that we have to solve, right? This is where all the technology companies are working. I would say we are still at an inception phase. We have not reached anywhere close to the peak. But in the next decade or so, I see a lot of these technology firms will be working on data, and the role of data scientists will become extremely critical in any organization going forward.
Can I just make a comment on that? So I think that's a good point. And I think it's oftentimes easy to forget how difficult it is to do disruptive innovation, and conversely how much easier it is to do incremental innovation. You don't have to disrupt anything in the traditional way. if you're doing incremental innovation, because you're addressing the needs of your existing customers and giving them a better experience, better service, better whatever. But by its nature, disruptive innovation is, and it's important, like that word doesn't mean what we think it does. It has a very specific meaning, which is the way that it was coined by Clayton Christensen and the work that he did. And it talks about bottom market entry. It talks about addressing the needs of large segments of customers that are not addressed by existing solutions. And it talks about, and effectively, in a traditional or in a corporate sense, you're kind of saying, not my customers. Small segment technology is not appropriate to my existing customers, or business model is not appropriate to my existing customers. And you can take a view of saying, well, I'm just going to leave it at that. The challenge with these technologies is that they have exponential or quadratic growth functions, and they typically have very strong first mover advantages. So if I use blockchain technology, for example, we believe that they will have blockchain networks will have very strong network effects, which means that once you have managed to pull off a successful, say, supply chain, blockchain network, it'll be very hard to compete against that kind of network. Same thing with machine learning or AI. The more data it ingests, the more capable it becomes, the harder it is for you to have a competitive solution. So the challenge, I guess, for large organizations is, once again, is like, on the one hand, it looks like there's never going to be a good time to do this because there's no revenue opportunity and it's not our existing customers that want it. But on the other hand, if you leave it for too long, then you're going to miss out on the opportunity of being one of those leaders in a space which has got very strong first mover advantages.
But Llew, isn't the challenge that for corporates or for established businesses, even if they are smaller businesses, is that it is very difficult to let go of what you have to go after what you don't have yet. If you then say that disruptive innovation is about going after customers that are not served, markets that are not established, practically to stop selling to wholesalers to make your month-end numbers because you want to reach the main market directly is take some bravery. So how do you bridge this gap if you are a real business that's making real revenue and real money and paying real people rather than building this new dream?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that your point is exactly valid, is that it's not about saying we're going to stop doing the things that generate revenue for us, that make us successful. But what it is about, like, we're going to invest into capabilities that we believe over long periods of time will be the source of competitive advantage. And when we are at a point where we start to see that the technology has matured, our customers are starting to ask for it, then we start to find ways of integrating that startup and its capabilities into the parent organization. But that takes a long time. So our view on it is that a minimum of 5 years, you leave the startup alone. You don't interfere in what it's trying to solve. Let it get on with its business. Let it work on its technology. Let it figure out what its go-to-market is. And it may or may not align with what you're trying to achieve. But the point is, across a portfolio of investments, you're going to find capabilities that you suddenly realize you're going to need. And at that point in time, you have the ability to integrate them, at least slowly initially, but increasingly faster over time as they're able to generate their own revenue, fight for their own resources, get involved in the politics of any large organization. And it's fine at that point in time. But initially, they have a very, very low likelihood of succeeding if you try to incorporate them right from the beginning into the parent organization.
I'd fully agree with that. I think it makes complete sense. And I would take it one step further. So as Llew was talking, I was thinking through, well, where are some successful examples in supply chain and logistics? And the few that I could point to are actually areas where companies didn't necessarily disrupt themselves, but what they did is what Llew said, is they created a new venture, or whether it was a startup they bought into or whether they created it themselves. They kept it separate from the company for at least 5 years. But the really successful ones are actually ones that disrupted an adjacent industry. So examples around your e-commerce players. So e-commerce players, their primary goal was to disrupt retail. But what a lot of them have done, the major ones like Amazon, like Alibaba, like JD, they've actually started disrupting the supply chain and logistics business through Amazon Logistics, through JD Logistics, through Tsenyao, the logistics subsidiary of Alibaba. And they've been massive disruptors. And they followed Lew's formula of we create a little startup on the side, and it does its own thing until it generates enough scale. But it didn't disrupt the core business, their core business. It disrupted kind of our core businesses, and it's going to do much more of that. So I think those are probably the areas for a large corporate to think about is how do I disrupt adjacent spaces rather than attacking my own core, which becomes problematic, as you mentioned, Cobus.
There's 5 minutes left. I want to spend that on data, insights as a disruptor. There's been lots of reference here to big data and analytics and needing more data scientists. My provocation would be that the challenge with disruption through data insights is also, not only, in the fact that many people rely on their intuition or experience to make decisions. And therefore, they are not prone to trust the data to provide new insights. So the point here is that, yes, there can be lots of data lakes and there could be lots of fantastic analytics and give them lots of acronyms for names. But if you do not get people to trust that their experience may not be complete, they're never going to adopt a new way of insights-based decision-making. Mm-hmm. And maybe, Christopher, starting with you from a sort of, again, an organizational change journey perspective, how do you bridge that gap to almost prove to the people that know they're right, that maybe they're not always right?
Exactly, and I mentioned this a little bit before in the previous presentation. Is that the model to strive for is the human plus machine. So it's not to say, oh, we can come up with these algorithms that are better than what you can do, and we don't need you anymore. But how do you get people to work well with the machine? And there are two pieces of that. One you'd mentioned, which is more of a cultural shift and getting them there. But the other thing is also a skill thing, is that a lot of the people who've got the experience don't necessarily have the tech savvy. They're not, they didn't grow up with this. So there's a bit of training. But one of the things that we've done is where you run A/B testing. And we did that with empty container repositioning, and because that's a whole forecasting model. Where, if you're an ocean carrier, where do you put all of your empty containers so that they'll be in the right place at the right time when your customers need you? It's a great one where you've got experienced people who think they know how to do it much better, and but you can also run an algorithm on that. And we did, it was more like A/B/C testing, where we had the experienced people actually repositioning containers. You had the algorithm doing it, but the one that worked best was the human plus machine. And you run the trials and you demonstrate to everybody. And I think because you're doing it as human plus machine, not that, this machine is better than the humans, it also is an easier way to get buy-in, but you actually have to demonstrate it sometimes.
Ayan or Llew?
Absolutely. I think change management is extremely critical in any organization. I think to add to that, I think KPIs are extremely important, right? And I believe seeing is believing, right? Now, if there's someone who's resistant to change, we need to demonstrate that change to him, right? And for that, KPIs are extremely important. If we can show that it's a machine who's doing a better job than human beings alone, that is something that we. But obviously, we can't ignore the fact that he has been doing the work for over the past 20, 30 years, right? So he can add his experience. So I always say machine plus human beings is a deadly combination, and that's where we can increase all the KPIs within the organization. You can see massive improvement in what they have been doing versus what they will do in future, right? So I think change management, KPI measurement to me is extremely important.
I think so. We've got this thesis around this concept of, maybe you've heard of it, it's called a digital LSP. And what a digital LSP is effectively is a business that runs entirely upon data. And whether it does have assets or doesn't have assets is a secondary issue. But what we believe is that in the short term, it's about visibility, and then shortly thereafter, it's about actionable insights, and then it is about supply chain orchestration. And the supply chain orchestration requires all of that other stuff to happen first, but you can only really start to apply these disruptive technologies, only really get the value from them once you get to the point where you have enough information and data in order to do orchestration. And so it's interesting for me talking about supply chain visibility and about how it's so desirable, but the reality is that is just the first step in the process. That is not the source of competitive advantage. And so I just thought, it is absolutely crucial. It's not a question of should we have the data. It's a question of who's going to own the data, who's going to allow you to have access to their data. Do you have to collect the data yourself? And ultimately, who's going to be able to monetize that data and enable orchestration with the data?
And then the clock strikes 0. Thank you very much. I can do some closing remarks, but I think that was great insights from people that work in the space, and no questions from you. So I suppose they were good enough answer. There's one. We are actually out of time, but if you want to be quick.
Sorry, yeah. So we actually have invested in RPA at the moment, but we're finding that a lot of our barriers is that our core operating system blocks from actually working in the system. So it's all fair and well to have this digitization strategy, but I feel like our operating systems that we're using haven't quite reached that level for us to actually digitize. So how do we get around that? And do you think there will be a change in the market to allow RPA to actually work in those cases?
So I think there's a long discussion around the automation, robotic process automation. But I think a lot of that does again come back to, and you can have maybe offline discussions of how the organization adopts that. So are you not getting in your own way to be able to do that? And I think it's obviously a technology question as well, but to what extent is it a people or a process question? Maybe my short answer to you. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us. Enjoy the rest of the day.